That audience listened with an intensity that was divinely anointed. God's presence filled that building.
At a stage when most leaders stand firm in their legacy, Pastor John Hagee, now 84, has offered a surprising confession that breaks his long history of certainty. Known for his unwavering voice in Christianity, he has revealed a moment of reflection that has left many stunned. The admission has sparked debate and curiosity, raising questions about what led a lifelong defender of strong beliefs to reconsider his own teachings. Inside the rise of a controversial pastor. For decades, John Hagee stood as one of the most recognizable and outspoken figures in modern Christianity. A pastor whose influence stretched far beyond church walls and deep into political conversation. His sermons were never quiet reflections. They were declarations, strong, unfiltered, and often controversial. While many admired his confidence and clarity, others saw something far more polarizing emerging beneath the surface, as his teachings began to stir debates that extended far beyond theology. His book, Jerusalem Countdown, released in 2006, intensified that divide. In it, Hagee explored end-times prophecy with bold certainty, suggesting scenarios involving global conflict and nuclear escalation tied to biblical fulfillment. To his supporters, this was prophetic insight grounded in Scripture. To critics, however, it felt like fear-driven speculation presented as divine truth. The book quickly became a lightning rod, pulling Hagee deeper into global attention and controversy. But it wasn't only prophecy that drew backlash. One of his most explosive and widely criticized statements involved his interpretation of historical tragedy, where he suggested that major events like the Holocaust were tied to a divine plan involving the establishment of Israel. The reaction was immediate and intense. Many condemned the statement as deeply insensitive, arguing that it reduced unimaginable human suffering into theological justification. The fallout strained relationships between Hagee and several religious and cultural communities, creating fractures that never fully healed. Despite the growing criticism, his influence did not shrink. In fact, it expanded. His followers saw him as a fearless defender of biblical truth, someone willing to speak even when the message was uncomfortable. Meanwhile, his critics argued that his rising political involvement and strong ideological positions were turning him into a divisive figure, one whose words carried consequences far beyond the pulpit. As support and opposition grew louder on both sides, Hagee remained firm in his interpretations, refusing to soften his stance. But the tension surrounding his message only deepened with time, raising a difficult question that many could no longer ignore. Was his influence guiding people toward clarity or pushing them further apart? And just as that question began to settle into public consciousness, a very different side of his beliefs started to emerge. One centered not on prophecy or politics, but on wealth, blessing, and the meaning of prosperity itself. The hidden cost of blessed living. Within John Hagee's teachings, one idea stands out as both powerful and deeply controversial: the belief that financial prosperity is not only possible for believers, but expected when one lives in obedience to God. For him, success is not random or purely worldly. It is tied to spiritual alignment. To follow God faithfully, in his view, is to walk into a life marked by blessing, favor, and yes, even material abundance. Hagee often frames prosperity as a reflection of divine approval. It is not simply about accumulating wealth for comfort or status, but about recognizing it as evidence that a person is walking in alignment with biblical principles. In this worldview, obedience leads to blessing, while disobedience results in lack. It's a clear, structured interpretation of faith, one that connects spiritual discipline directly to earthly outcomes. However, this belief also introduces a far more difficult and controversial implication: the idea that poverty is not just a circumstance, but a condition tied to spiritual failure. Hagee has at times suggested that lack or financial struggle can be linked to disobedience or distance from God's will. Within this framework, poverty becomes more than an economic issue. It becomes a spiritual warning sign. This perspective aligns closely with what many describe as the prosperity gospel, a movement that teaches material success as a visible sign of God's blessing. Hagee, while not always fully aligning himself with every expression of that movement, shares enough of its core ideas that comparisons are often unavoidable. To supporters, this message is empowering. It encourages believers to expect better, to pray boldly, and to believe that faith can influence their material reality. Yet for critics, this is where concern begins. Many theologians and observers argue that such teachings oversimplify suffering and ignore the complex realities behind poverty, ranging from systemic inequality to health struggles and circumstances beyond personal control. They question whether faith should be measured through financial outcomes at all, warning that this mindset risks turning spirituality into a transaction. Despite the debate, Hagee continues to emphasize that God's promises include abundance, not only in spirit, but also in life's tangible blessings. His sermons often encourage followers to step into that promise with confidence, to see themselves as recipients of divine generosity rather than victims of circumstance. But as his teachings on prosperity continued to spread, they also began to attract sharper criticism, especially as his influence grew beyond the pulpit and into larger cultural conversations. The tension between faith, wealth, and responsibility only deepened, setting the stage for a moment in his journey where belief itself would be challenged in ways no one expected. And when that shift finally came, it didn't arrive as another doctrine or sermon, but as a deeply personal realization that would reshape how people viewed the man behind the message. A confession from the pulpit. For most of his ministry, John Hagee was known for something very specific: certainty. His sermons rarely left room for ambiguity. Scripture, in his teachings, was presented as clear, direct, and authoritative. Followers came to expect answers, not questions. So when he stood before his congregation and revealed something far more vulnerable, it immediately disrupted the image people had built of him for decades. In a moment that caught many off guard, Hagee admitted that his long-standing need for absolute answers in Scripture may have limited his understanding of faith itself. Instead of confidence without hesitation, he began to speak about uncertainty, reflection, and the possibility that belief is not always meant to be neatly resolved. It was a striking contrast to the voice people were used to hearing from the pulpit. He shared that faith, in its deeper form, may not always provide immediate clarity. Rather than being a system of fixed conclusions, he suggested it might be a journey where questions are not weaknesses, but part of spiritual growth. For someone who had built a reputation on firm declarations, this acknowledgement felt almost like a reset. The reaction was immediate. Some members of his congregation were visibly moved, seeing a more human side of their longtime leader. Others were left unsettled, unsure how to reconcile this softer, more reflective tone with the authoritative figure they had followed for years. It wasn't just a sermon. It felt like a shift in identity. What made the moment even more powerful was its honesty. Hagee wasn't presenting a new doctrine or rewriting Scripture. Instead, he was revealing a personal realization that certainty alone might not be the full picture of faith. That admission created a ripple effect, forcing many listeners to reflect on their own spiritual expectations and assumptions. This wasn't a rejection of belief, but a reframing of it. Faith, as he described it in that moment, became less about having answers and more about learning how to live with unanswered questions. That idea alone marked a dramatic departure from the style that had defined his ministry for so long. And yet, this unexpected vulnerability didn't come out of nowhere. Behind the public sermons and theological positions, there had always been a larger story unfolding, one built through years of expansion, influence, and the creation of a ministry that would eventually grow far beyond its original foundation. When ministry became a global platform, John Hagee's influence didn't happen overnight, and it didn't begin on a global stage. It started in a far more modest setting when he first stepped into ministry in San Antonio in the mid-1960s. What began as a small local church eventually laid the groundwork for something far larger than anyone could have predicted at the time. Just under a decade later, that vision took a defining step forward with the founding of Cornerstone Church in 1975. From its early beginnings, Cornerstone was never meant to remain small. Under Hagee's leadership, it expanded rapidly, eventually becoming one of the most prominent megachurches in the United States. What once started as a gathering of a few families grew into a congregation numbering in the tens of thousands. At its peak, more than 22,000 members were part of the church community, making it a major force in American evangelical life. But Cornerstone was more than just a place of worship. It became a full-scale community hub where faith intersected with outreach, education, and charitable work. Hagee envisioned a space where religion was not confined to Sunday services, but extended into everyday life, shaping how people lived, gave, and connected with one another. That vision helped transform the church into something much broader than a traditional congregation. As his influence grew locally, it quickly expanded nationally through media. Through John Hagee Ministries, his sermons reached audiences far beyond Texas. Television broadcasts, radio programs, and later digital platforms allowed his teachings to circulate across the United States and into international markets. His voice became familiar in homes far beyond his physical church, giving him a level of reach that few pastors of his generation achieved. Alongside his ministry, Hagee also became increasingly involved in political and international causes. One of the most defining moments came with the creation of Christians United for Israel in 2006, an organization dedicated to strengthening support for Israel among Christian communities. This initiative tied his religious beliefs directly to global political advocacy, solidifying his reputation as a pastor who operated not only within spiritual circles, but also on the world stage. With each expansion, church, media, and political engagement, Hagee's presence grew stronger and more complex. He was no longer just a local pastor. He had become a national figure with influence that extended into policy, ideology, and public discourse. And yet, as his reach widened and his legacy solidified, another layer of his life story began to surface, one shaped not by public influence, but by the private foundation that formed long before the spotlight ever found him. The making of John Hagee. Long before John Hagee became a national figure in ministry, his story began in the quiet town of Baytown, Texas. Born in 1940, he grew up in an environment where faith wasn't occasional. It was part of everyday life. His father, a devoted minister, played a central role in shaping the spiritual atmosphere of their home, where Scripture was not just read but actively discussed and lived out. In the Hagee household, religion was deeply woven into routine. Evenings were often spent around the table with Bible readings, reflection, and conversation about faith and purpose. These early experiences created a strong foundation in young John's mind, planting the seeds of discipline, belief, and responsibility that would later define his path. But it wasn't only structured teaching that influenced him, it was observation. Watching his father serve a congregation gave him first-hand insight into what ministry truly demanded. He saw the weight of leadership, the responsibility of guiding others, and the emotional strength required to stand in front of a community with conviction. These lessons were absorbed long before he ever considered stepping into a pulpit himself. As he grew older, that early environment shaped more than just belief. It shaped direction. Faith became more than tradition. It became purpose. Even as he moved toward adulthood, the influence of his upbringing remained steady, quietly guiding his decisions and ambitions. Eventually, that foundation would carry him far beyond Baytown. What started as a childhood surrounded by Scripture and ministry slowly evolved into a life dedicated to expanding those same values on a much larger scale. The transition from small-town upbringing to national influence didn't happen suddenly. It was built step by step, rooted in the lessons of his early years. Still, while his foundation was spiritual, his journey toward becoming a leader required more than just belief. It demanded education, structure, and a deeper understanding of how to communicate ideas on a larger stage. And that next phase of his life would take him beyond his hometown and into institutions that would help refine both his voice and his vision for ministry. Shaping a future preacher. Before John Hagee became a recognized voice in ministry, his path included a strong academic foundation that helped shape how he would later communicate, lead, and interpret his faith. After finishing high school, he continued his studies at Trinity University in San Antonio, where he pursued a Bachelor of Science degree. This stage of his life was not only about earning credentials, but also about developing discipline and a broader way of thinking that extended beyond his upbringing. His time at Trinity University exposed him to structured learning and critical thinking. It was here that he began to build the intellectual habits that would later support his leadership style. While his faith background had already given him direction, his education added a layer of clarity and communication skills that would become essential in his future role as a pastor. After completing his undergraduate studies, Hagee further advanced his academic journey by earning a master's degree in education from the University of North Texas. This step reflected more than ambition. It showed a commitment to understanding how knowledge is taught, shared, and received. Education became a tool that complemented his spiritual calling, rather than competing with it. During these years, two important aspects of his identity began to merge. On one side was his strong religious foundation rooted in scripture and family tradition. On the other was his growing academic understanding of communication, leadership, and structure. Together, these elements began shaping a future ministry that would be both expressive and highly organized. This combination of education and faith gave Hagee a unique advantage when he eventually stepped into public ministry. He was not only speaking from belief, but also from a developed ability to present ideas clearly and persuasively. His background allowed him to connect theological concepts with everyday understanding, making his messages accessible to large audiences. Over time, this blend of learning and belief became a defining part of his leadership style. It helped him transition from student to teacher, and eventually from preacher to influential public figure. The skills he developed in academic settings would later support his expansion into media, publishing, and large-scale ministry operations. But while education helped refine his voice, life outside the classroom would soon test something far more personal. Behind the growing success and expanding influence, challenges were forming that would push him beyond theory and into real-world struggle, testing not just his knowledge, but his resilience and faith in ways no academic environment ever could. The struggles no one talks about. Before John Hagee became a widely recognized figure in ministry, his life also included deeply personal struggles that tested both his faith and resilience. One of the most difficult moments came in 1975, when his first marriage to Martha Downing ended in divorce. For a pastor serving in a conservative religious environment, this was not just a private issue. It became a public challenge that affected how people viewed his leadership and spiritual credibility. The impact was immediate. Within his community, questions began to surface about whether someone facing such personal failure could continue to lead a growing congregation. For a time, the pressure was overwhelming. Critics doubted his stability, while supporters struggled to reconcile his role as a spiritual guide with the reality of his personal life falling apart. It was a moment that placed both his ministry and identity under serious strain. Despite the criticism, Hagee did not step away from his calling. Instead, he began rebuilding his life step by step, holding on to his belief that his mission was not finished. That period of uncertainty became a turning point rather than an ending. It forced him to confront hardship in a way that sermons alone never could. In 1976, a new chapter began when he married Diana Castro. This relationship would become a stabilizing force in his life, offering emotional grounding during one of the most difficult transitions he had ever experienced. Diana's presence brought balance, support, and renewed focus, allowing him to slowly regain confidence in both his personal and ministerial journey. Together, they built a partnership that extended beyond marriage. As Hagee continued leading his growing church, Diana stood beside him through the pressures of public life, ministry demands, and expanding responsibilities. Their shared commitment became a foundation that helped him move forward despite earlier setbacks. Over time, what once looked like a defining failure turned into a story of endurance. His ability to continue leading after personal collapse added another layer to his public image. Not one of perfection, but of persistence. It showed that his journey was not shaped by flawless moments, but by the ability to rise again after falling. And as his ministry continued to expand and his influence reached even greater heights, the story of his life moved toward a new chapter, one where public success, private struggle, and a final unexpected admission would begin to intersect in ways few could have predicted. Thanks for watching. If this story gave you insight into John Hagee's journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into influential figures and untold stories.